Billionaire was about to lose everything, until a janitor's daughter revealed the truth. The cameras loved the fall of a giant. News tickers flashed a countdown to ruin as a once-admired billionaire faced the kind of lawsuit that ends empires. Investors fled. Sponsors vanished. In court, a stack of contracts painted him as the architect of a quiet, calculated discrimination ring that kept minority-owned vendors locked out, and minority managers stalled at the ceiling. It looked airtight, almost too perfect. In the third row sat a young woman in a plain blazer, gripping a notebook with the stubborn calm of someone who had been invisible all her life. She was a janitor's daughter, and she had brought a key. He built his fortune on beautiful promises, transparent hiring practices, fair supply chains, and a public pledge to combat bias with data. For years, glossy reports showcased progress charts and diversity photos that clung to shareholder letters like medals. His headquarters, glass, steel, and sunlight, was a temple to the idea that merit would finally outrun the old rules. It was easy to believe from the lobby. Upstairs, boardrooms hummed with plans and optimism. Downstairs, night crews pushed carts past framed mission statements. The lawsuit struck like a winter storm. A coalition of former employees and displaced vendors alleged that behind the slogans lay an algorithmic trap. Performance rubrics that graded minority candidates more harshly, vendor scorecards that favored old guard suppliers under the guise of risk, and contracts that bound small firms to impossible terms. The evidence arrived polished, spreadsheets with tidy columns, metadata that matched, and signatures reconstructed into timelines that flowed without a ripple. The billionaire called it a lie, then stopped talking. Every denial looked like theater against the tide of documentation. The court of public opinion had no patience for nuance. Investors maneuvered to eject him through moral clauses hidden in financing agreements. What began as a discrimination suit had evolved into a boardroom ambush. In that third row sat the janitor's daughter. She had grown up on those night shifts, doing homework beneath the glow of vending machines while her mother mopped the reflective floors. She had sat in the shadow of framed awards, tasting the distance between the mission on the wall and the air in the hallway. She studied statistics because numbers at least pretended to be fair. Now she worked as a junior data auditor for a small nonprofit. This kind of comb goes through corporate disclosures after the headlines have moved on. She came to court because the case smelled like lemon cleaner and old injustice. The first week felt like a parade of certainty. Former managers described evaluations that shifted like a trap door. Their ratings dipped when they mentored staff of color, rose when they avoided employee resource group meetings, and never rose high enough to break into the circle where promotions truly occurred. Vendors submitted detailed bids that were initially submitted to a portal. Then they reappeared months later as non-compliant, often after their credit lines had been exhausted. A consultant introduced a model that he claimed flagged reputational risk in supply partners. The output looked sterile. The consequences felt surgical. The billionaire sat impassive, his tie too neat for the sinking feeling beneath it. He had trusted the machine. He had trusted people who promised the machine would be better than people. Now every line of code sounded like a loaded question. He remembered the day he signed the new risk framework, the afternoon he approved the vendor portal consolidation, the cheerful summary deck with its soothing icons. He had demanded fairness and speed. He was getting neither. The janitor's daughter watched the exhibits and felt a sense of unease, as if something was misaligned. The spreadsheets were too clean. Memos labeled draft had change histories that didn't reflect iteration. The risk model documentation cited peer-reviewed methods but linked to preprints that did not exist. Most telling, the vendor scorecard showed no missing values, not even once over 2 years of nationwide operations. In real data, blanks are like dust. They collect in corners. She remembered the building's night shift rhythms, the way particular floors smelled of cologne and aftershave at odd hours. The way security badges sometimes flashed bright red, then green again, after a guard typed something quietly. She remembered a corridor on level 5 where the motion lights snapped on a beat too late, and how her mother always nudged her to walk close to the wall. In a life surrounded by other people's systems, she had learned to memorize patterns and to distrust perfection. She pulled the public filings. She copied the portal screenshots shown in court. She compared the panel fonts and button paddings, as design details often betray timelines. She noticed that an export button in last year's screenshots used a component released only 6 months ago by the vendor. The chronology buckled. She downloaded archived copies of the company's careers page from web caches and traced the evolution of the performance framework language, then aligned it with the timing of when certain executives cashed stock grants. The peaks lined up too neatly. She asked for a seat at the nonprofit's tiny war room, then volunteered for the ugliest task, dragging through contracts and PDFs at 2 a.m., highlighting every clause that allowed for emergency overrides, stabilization modes, and manual adjudication. On the 30th hour, she discovered a clause hidden within a vendor onboarding appendix that allowed for a block list sync from legacy suppliers as an interim risk control. She marked 2 words with a shaking hand: interim, legacy. Interim stretches without witnesses. Legacy is another memory word. It cannot be questioned. On day 4, an operations director testified with the calm of someone holding a parachute. He claimed they never used manual overrides. She knew he was lying, not because she knew him, but because the human world inevitably intersects with the machine world. She had watched too many janitors prop doors with empty boxes, while a badge system blinked, "Access denied." There is always a workaround. She drafted a memo explaining her concerns, then stopped. She was not on the legal team. She was not a plaintiff. She was a janitor's daughter with a notebook and a fear of wasted chances. That night, she went back to the building, not as a trespasser, but as a guest. The nonprofit had secured temporary access to review public area systems for a separate transparency project. She stood in the lobby, her mother once buffed to a mirror. The security guard was new, the badges were newer, but the air still hummed with the same polished indifference. She checked the vendor kiosk. She scanned the QR code labeled Supplier Help and found herself on a help page with a footer date that contradicted the court exhibits by 2 fiscal quarters. She saved the page, including metadata. Then she saw the cleaning staff shuffling carts toward the freight elevators, faces turned toward the floor. She felt an old heat rise. She asked for nothing. She owed them more than a question. She owed them proof. On the Monday that decided fates, the courtroom waited for a final swing. The coalition's lawyers prepared to rest, confident that the pile of immaculate evidence would crush any doubt. The defense planned to call a single expert to explain away anomalies, then pivot to settlement. The billionaire's posture suggested surrender in good tailoring. The judge invited amicus materials from public interest groups, and the nonprofit sent a brief signed by a junior auditor who was not expected to be a key contributor. The brief did not shout. It simply laid out a sequence that broke the spell of perfection. First, it noted that the vendor portal screenshots in the complaint displayed an interface component unavailable during the period they were claimed to represent. The brief included archived developer release notes, cached site copies, and UI library changelogs time-stamped by independent repositories. Second, it showed that the help page for rejected vendors carried a footer date inconsistent with the exhibits, implying post hoc editing. Third, it mapped a handful of manual adjudication clauses that survived into production despite official denials. Cross-referenced with internal maintenance schedules, the brief identified weeks when the system claimed to be fully automated while the back end was in stabilization mode, a euphemism for human hands steering outcomes. Finally, the brief overlaid executive stock award dates with policy toggles that tightened vendor risk thresholds. The correlation did not prove intent, but the timing created a pattern. Stricter thresholds coincided with quarters when legacy suppliers, controlled mainly by allies of certain executives, benefited. At the same time, minority-owned entrants were halted for risk review. The paper trail suggested that the discrimination was real, but that the author of the scheme was not the man on trial. It was his inner circle, shielding their preferred suppliers and building a case that would push him out under the cover of moral outrage. The courtroom shifted. The judge asked narrow questions. Chain of custody gaps widened. For the first time, the billionaire looked at the third row. He did not recognize the woman with the calm eyes and the notebook. She recognized the shape of his relief and felt nothing soft for it. The point was never to rescue a man. The point was to rescue the truth, and with it, the people harmed in the quiet.